If you've worked with some full-featured IDEs in the past, things like Eclipse or NetBeans or Visual Studio, you're probably familiar with the idea of opening a project and getting this very abstracted view of all the source code. You may have an Explorer on the left-hand side that allows you to explore classes and objects as opposed to files themselves, and it's a very complicated, very in-depth interface for working with your project. Well, Visual Studio Code does not do that. Visual Studio Code really works with your source code at three levels: the file level, the folder level, and then lastly, the workspace level. Here's how that works. Let's start with just opening up a file. I'm going to hit Control O, and I'm going to open up this hello world.py file. Now, I can work with individual files like this. I can modify my Python code. I can execute it up here because I have Python installed and linked up to my Visual Studio Code. So I can just click debug and start debugging right away if I want to run this code. But that's fine. That's just editing a single individual file, right? If I need to open up a new file, I hit Control O and I find the next file. So the next thing that you can actually do, you'll bring up the file menu here, is you see that you can open a folder, which is Control K, Control O. So Control K, Control O, and I'm going to open up a folder now. And I'm going to open up this folder, the root folder that hello world.py was in. So I'm already navigated into that folder. I'll just say select folder. And what it's done for me here, it flew up my Explorer on the right-hand side, is now I'm looking at this folder inside of my Explorer, and I can see all of the files the Visual Studio Code cares about inside of this folder. There's a desktop.ini, and there's hello world.py. So now I can select it, and it's over here on the left-hand side, and as I select different files, this stays over here on the right-hand side. I can use Control B to hide it. I don't have to look at it when I'm writing away my code, but when I want to navigate to files again, I just hit Control B and pop it back open. I can also add new files or new folders into this folder just by right-clicking over here and saying New File. So I can say another file.py, and that adds a new py file here, and I could right-click and I could even say New Folder and say New Folder 1. And there is a new folder inside of my Explorer. And if I look at Windows Explorer, I can see that it just created these files and these folders right here inside of this folder itself. So all I'm really doing is kind of creating files and folders and working with files and folders inside of this folder, and there is no additional settings or nothing else saved with this folder. I can come here and say close folder. Guess what? It's gone. I'm back to my regular Visual Studio Code interface. Now that's all well and good. It's simple, fast, and easy to get up and running with files and folders and source code that you may have already written when you want to switch over to Visual Studio Code. But what about some additional features, something associated normally with a project or a workspace in another IDE? Well, Visual Studio Code does have the idea of a workspace, and I'm going to start by opening up that folder again, called My Project Folder. Now, this is nothing more than a folder, and I can open it up as much as I want, but there are some things that can be saved to this folder, which would turn it into what we call a workspace. To show that off, I am going to start by opening the settings for Visual Studio Code, Control Comma, if you don't recall. And I showed this off in another video, but one of the things that I did not talk about was this little option up here, User versus Workspace. And as I filter back and forth, you can see the font editor is different between user and workspace. So if I come over here to workspace and let's say, you know what? I want this workspace to have consoleless font. I'm just going to change that, hit Control S, and look what's happened. Up here on the right-hand side, my Explorer has created a .vs Code folder, and inside there is a settings.json file. And if I click that, you can see it's got one single setting, my font family. So what's happening? Well, my settings are being overridden. My user settings apply across the board unless the particular folder that I'm working in has a .vs Code folder with a settings.json. In that case, this folder now has its own settings, and any of the settings that are defined there override the settings that are applying to my overall Visual Studio Code installation. But it's still not quite a workspace. In order to do that, I'm going to say File, Add Folder to Workspace, or actually I'll just save Workspace as. So now I'm going to create a new workspace here in My Project folder, and we'll call it My Project Workspace. Makes sense, right? And what has it done to me now? It's created one additional file right here, My Project Workspace.code workspace. When I select this, I can see that it's got a JSON structure with two options, folders and settings. And it's only got one folder listed, the path of dot, which is the current folder. So I created this workspace file inside of this folder here, my workspace.code. So it's indicating that this folder is a workspace, is the root of a workspace. And that's exactly what I'm looking at now. If I open up my settings again, Control Comma, we can see that now I've got a third tab up at the right here. I've not just my user settings and not just my project folder settings, which are the settings from settings.json up here in my .vs Code folder. I've also got workspace settings. And one of the things that we can tell just based on the order, user, workspace, folder, is that is the order of preference that they will take. So first the user settings will apply, but if it's overridden by workspace settings, those workspace settings will apply. And then lastly, if it's overridden by even the folder settings, then the folder settings will apply. So my folder font family right now is set to Consolus. I can come here to Workspace and I could update this to, for example, Courier New. Control S to save that. And now here in my settings.json, my folder settings, I can see it's still Consolus. My workspace settings, it's now Courier New. But if I look at a code file, it's still showing me Consolus because that is the overriding option there. Now let's come here to my workspace and I'll change my font, for example, to 18 instead of 14. Now I've got a new font in my workspace. It's size 18. Notice we can already see the font jumped up in size. Settings.json does not override that here inside of my .vs Code folder. So that is the applicable font size. And if I come here to settings.json and say, oh, you know what? I didn't want that to happen. I'm going to just delete this. Click Save. Now my workspace settings are overriding Courier New, and all of my font is Courier New size 18. So that is what a project folder is, a workspace inside of Visual Studio Code. You can also add additional folders to your workspace. If we come, say, File, Add Folder to Workspace, check out a neat thing that happens here. If I select Second Workspace Folder and click Add, I get a new folder added to my project folder, to my workspace root folder. And that is referenced here inside of my JSON file. You can see my folders now has two things in it. It has path dot, which is the current path. So whatever folder this exists in is going to be my workspace folder. And I have a second path that is referenced by its absolute path, and that is another folder that's included in my workspace. And I can treat this folder just like any other. I can add files and folders to it, and it has become part of my workspace, part of my project. But there's something cool that I want to show you. My project folder in settings.json is overriding my font. That font is Consolus, so we are seeing Consolus font. That settings does not apply to this folder. So if I create a new file here, and let's just call it thirdfile.py, and I start typing in here, we can see that this file is showing Courier New. The workspace settings apply to this folder. They do not pick up from settings.json in my project folder because it's in a different folder. It's a different root folder. So this second workspace folder that I've added has got its own file settings, which we can see if we open up our settings menu. I'll hit Control comma. I've still got user workspace, and then here I've got a drop down. I can change the settings for my project folder. There's Consolus. I could change the settings for second workspace folder. We'll make this one monospace just to highlight it as something different. Hit Control Save. What's happened? That's right, I've got a new .vs Code folder inside of second workspace folder, and that's got its own settings.json file. So every folder can have its own individual font settings that override the workspace settings. The workspace settings apply to every folder that has been added to this workspace, assuming that you are currently editing this particular workspace. And then lastly, the user settings for the entire VS Code take effect. So that is how files and folders and workspaces relate to one another in Visual Studio Code. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but I think once you understand it, it's relatively straightforward. It's a very waterfall effect. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.